Blood pounds in my ears as I stand before the judge. My wedding day. I'm 68 years old, and I'm marrying my mother's husband. Do you, Eleanor Washington, take this man, Richard Caldwell, to be your lawfully wedded husband? The courthouse air feels thick enough to choke on. The white roses in my grip have begun to wilt, their sweetness turning sickly in the tense atmosphere. My mother's sob from the front row slices through me. A sound I've never heard from her before. Not even at my father's funeral. Richard's fingers dig into my wrist. A warning. His smile never reaches his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that watched me across countless Sunday dinners for 30 years. The same eyes that appraised my mother like property while he drained her bank accounts. The same eyes that narrowed when he told me last week, "Marry me, Eleanor, or your mother dies alone in a state facility where you'll never find her." Eleanor. The judge shifts uncomfortably. Everyone's staring. The bruises on my mother's arms are hidden beneath her Sunday cardigan. The paperwork showing the second mortgage Richard took out on her house is locked in my safe. The recordings of his threats are with my attorney. And the key that will destroy him is this wedding certificate. My voice catches. The ancient wall clock ticks like a bomb. Richard leans closer, whispering through that perfect public smile. "Say it, or I sign the commitment papers today." I meet his gaze directly for the first time. Something flickers in his expression. Uncertainty? Good. I do. My voice is suddenly strong, surprising everyone, especially Richard. The judge hesitates, sensing something deeply wrong. By the power vested in me. As Richard moves to kiss me, I turn my face. His lips brush my cheek, cold and dry as a snake's belly. My mother's whimper echoes off the courthouse walls. What Richard doesn't know, what no one knows, is that those two words, "I do," weren't my surrender. They were my declaration of war. Before we get into the rest of the story, comment where you're tuning in from, and if this story has touched you, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, I had been enjoying my peaceful retirement. After 35 years as a high school principal in Atlanta, I'd settled into a comfortable routine of community volunteering, book clubs, and weekly dinners with my mother, Coraline. That particular Sunday, I arrived at her house with sweet potato pie in hand, looking forward to our usual evening together. But something was wrong. The normally immaculate front yard was overgrown, and several newspapers lay scattered on the porch. Mom always read her paper with morning coffee. She hadn't missed a day in 50 years. I let myself in with my key. "Mom. Richard." I called out. The house was eerily quiet. I made my way to the kitchen, where I found my mother sitting alone at the table, staring at a pile of papers. "Mom, what's going on? Where's Richard?" She looked up slowly, her usual vibrant expression replaced with something hollow. "He's gone to his lodge meeting. Sunday evenings, you know that." I did know that. Richard's lodge meetings were as regular as clockwork, though I'd always had my suspicions about where he really went. "What are all these papers?" I asked, setting down the pie and taking a seat beside her. "Bills," she said simply. "And notices. And I don't understand any of it, Ellie." I picked up the first document, a mortgage statement from a bank I didn't recognize. The outstanding balance was staggering. I grabbed another. A credit card bill in my mother's name with charges from casinos and liquor stores. Then medical bills, late notices, and finally a foreclosure warning. "Mom," I said carefully, "did you know about any of this?" She shook her head slowly. "Richard handles all the finances. He always has. He gives me a little allowance each week for groceries." Her voice cracked. "He said I wasn't good with money, and I believed him. For 30 years I believed him." As I sorted through the papers, a sickening picture emerged. Richard had been draining my mother's accounts for years, her retirement savings, the inheritance from my father, even taking out loans against the house my parents had paid off decades ago. It was systematic financial abuse, and he'd hidden it masterfully. "We need to talk to the bank," I said firmly. "Tomorrow morning we'll go together, Anne." The front door slammed shut. "Coraline? Is Eleanor here? I smell her pie." My mother's reaction was immediate and disturbing. She hurriedly gathered the papers, her hands shaking as she tried to hide them in a kitchen drawer. I caught her wrist gently. "Mom, we need to address this," I whispered. "He'll be so angry," she whispered back, fear etched into the lines of her face. Richard appeared in the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. At 79, he still carried himself with the authority of the bank manager he'd been before retirement. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed, his polo shirt crisply ironed. "What's this little secret meeting about?" he asked, his tone jovial but his eyes sharp. I stood, papers in hand. "Richard, we need to talk about these. The mortgage, the credit cards, the foreclosure notice." His expression hardened for just a moment before he laughed. "Oh, those old things. Coraline, you weren't supposed to worry about those. I told you I'm handling it." "By taking out a second mortgage on Mom's house without telling her?" I challenged. "Our house," he corrected smoothly. "And sometimes in a marriage, one partner handles the complicated matters to spare the other unnecessary stress." He turned to my mother. "Isn't that right, dear?" To my dismay, my mother nodded. "Richard knows best about these things." "See." Richard smiled triumphantly. "Now why don't we enjoy that pie? Financial talk gives me indigestion." I wanted to argue further, but the pleading look in my mother's eyes stopped me. I reluctantly set the papers aside, but I didn't return them to the drawer. Instead, I slipped them into my purse when Richard turned to get plates. The evening proceeded with painful normality. Richard dominating the conversation, my mother barely speaking, and me seething silently. When I left, Richard walked me to the door. "I think it might be best if you skipped next Sunday's dinner," he said quietly. "Coraline gets so upset after your visits. It's not good for her blood pressure." "You can't keep me from seeing my mother," I replied. His smile didn't waver. "Of course not. I would never suggest such a thing. I'm simply concerned about her health." He patted my shoulder condescendingly. "You understand, being unmarried and childless as you are, that sometimes you can be a bit intense. Coraline needs calm at her age." The barb stung as intended. My personal choices, focusing on my career and education rather than marriage, devoting myself to other people's children rather than having my own, had always been a point of contention with Richard. "Good night, Richard," I said stiffly, refusing to engage. That night, I spread the papers across my dining room table and began to piece together the extent of Richard's deception. The more I discovered, the more horrified I became. He had been systematically stealing from my mother for years, and worse, he had managed to get his name on nearly all her assets. The next day, I met with a lawyer friend, Josephine Harris. We'd worked together on school district issues before my retirement, and I trusted her judgment. "It's elder financial abuse, clear as day," Josephine said after reviewing the documents. "But proving it won't be easy, if your mother won't testify against him." "She won't," I interrupted. "She's completely under his influence." "Then our options are limited." Josephine tapped her pen against her legal pad. "We could petition for guardianship, arguing that she's being unduly influenced, but that's a long, expensive process, and without her cooperation." She sighed. "The courts are reluctant to take away an elderly person's autonomy without compelling evidence of incapacity." "She's not incapacitated, she's being manipulated," I insisted. "I understand that, but legally, it's a difficult distinction to prove." Josephine paused. "There's something else you should know. I took the liberty of running a background check on Richard Caldwell." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a series of newspaper clippings and court records dating back decades. The oldest was a small article from 1989 about the sudden death of Richard's first wife, ruled an accident despite suspicious circumstances. Then came records of his second marriage and subsequent divorce, with the ex-wife filing for a restraining order that was later dismissed. Finally, there were financial records showing a pattern of mismanagement at the bank where he'd worked, though no charges were ever filed. "He's done this before," I whispered, the realization washing over me like ice water. "It appears so," Josephine confirmed. "And he's gotten away with it each time." I left Josephine's office with a sick feeling in my stomach. That evening, I called my mother repeatedly, but Richard answered each time, making excuses about why she couldn't come to the phone. By the third call, he didn't bother with pleasantries. Stop calling Eleanor. Coraline doesn't want to speak with you right now. Your accusations have upset her greatly. I need to hear that from her, I insisted. There was a pause, then my mother's voice, timid and distant. Ellie, please. Richard says we need some space right now. I'll call you when I'm feeling better. The line went dead. For 2 weeks, I couldn't reach her. I drove by the house daily, but the curtains remained drawn. I left messages, sent emails, even contacted their neighbors, but Richard had constructed a perfect wall between us. When I tried to visit, he informed me through the door that my mother was resting and threatened to call the police if I didn't leave. On the 15th day of this torment, I received a text message from an unknown number. Meet me at Piedmont Park by the lake. 2 p.m. Come alone. My heart raced as I drove to the park. I found my mother sitting on a bench, looking smaller and frilier than I'd ever seen her. She wore sunglasses despite the cloudy day, and kept glancing around nervously. Mom. I rushed to her side. What's happening? Are you okay? She removed her sunglasses, revealing a fading bruise around her left eye. Oh my God, I gasped. Did he do this to you? She nodded almost imperceptibly. He found the missing papers. Said I betrayed him by showing them to you. Her voice was barely audible. This was just a warning, he said. Fury rose within me. We're going to the police. Right now. No. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. You don't understand. He has everything in his name now. The house, the cars, even my medical decisions. He's got a doctor friend who's willing to declare me incompetent if I cause trouble. She swallowed hard. And he said if I try to leave him, he'll make sure I never see you again. He can't do that, I insisted, though I wasn't certain it was true. He can and he will. She squeezed my hand. I shouldn't have come today, but I had to warn you. He's planning something, Ellie. He keeps making phone calls, talking about taking care of the Eleanor problem. I'm scared for you. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, I asked, what can I do, Mom? How can I help you? She shook her head. I don't think anyone can help me now. I've been such a fool. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. 30 years with a man who never loved me, who only wanted what I had. Your father would be so ashamed of me. No, I said firmly. Dad would understand. He knew how lonely you were after he died. Richard took advantage of that. A distant church bell chimed twice. My mother stood abruptly. I have to go. He thinks I'm at my doctor's appointment. The nurse is his friend. She'll cover for me this once, but I can't be late getting back. I stood as well, desperate to keep her with me. Mom, please. Come home with me. We'll figure this out together. She cupped my face in her hands, a gesture so familiar from my childhood that it nearly broke me. My brave, smart Ellie. Always trying to fix everything. She kissed my cheek. Some things can't be fixed. But promise me you'll be careful. Richard is dangerous, more than you know. Before I could respond, she hurried away, leaving me standing alone by the lake, my reflection in the water as fractured as my heart. The next day, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. Inside was a restraining order, prohibiting me from coming within 500 feet of my mother or her residence. The petition, allegedly filed by my mother, claimed I had become emotionally abusive and was attempting to alienate her from her husband. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably forged. I'd seen my mother's handwriting all my life, on school permission slips, birthday cards, and grocery lists. This looping, uncertain scrawl wasn't hers. I immediately called Josephine, who agreed to challenge the order. But when we appeared in court 3 days later, we were met with a devastating sight. My mother, frail and subdued, testifying that she was indeed afraid of me and wanted the protection of the court. She was always jealous of Richard, she said, her voice monotone as if reciting memorized lines. She never accepted him as my husband. Now she's trying to turn me against him, saying terrible things. Richard sat beside her, a supportive hand on her shoulder, his expression one of pained concern. The judge, seeing an elderly woman apparently in fear of her daughter, had little choice but to uphold the restraining order. Outside the courthouse, Richard approached me while my mother waited in the car. This could have been avoided, he said pleasantly, as if discussing the weather. Family discord is so unpleasant. What do you want, Richard? I demanded. Simply for you to respect your mother's wishes. His smile never reached his eyes. She's chosen me, Eleanor. She always has. Perhaps it's time you accepted that and moved on with your life. I know what you're doing, I said, keeping my voice low but intense. And I won't stop until my mother is safe from you. His expression hardened momentarily before the pleasant mask returned. Such drama. This is exactly why Coraline needs space from you. He checked his watch. I'd best be going. Your mother tires so easily these days. As he turned to leave, he added casually, Oh, and Eleanor? I've hired a private investigator to ensure you respect the restraining order. One violation, and you'll find yourself explaining to a judge why you should remain a free woman. He chuckled. Imagine how that would affect your sterling reputation in the community. I watched helplessly as he drove away with my mother, the restraining order effectively cutting me off from the one person I was desperate to protect. After the crushing defeat in court, I retreated to my home, overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness. For 3 days, I barely ate or slept, replaying every interaction with Richard over the past 30 years, searching for signs I should have noticed earlier. The guilt was crushing. On the 4th day, I was startled by a knock at my door. Standing on my porch was Darlene Jenkins, my mother's best friend from church. I've been trying to reach you, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Coraline slipped me your address years ago. Told me to come find you if anything ever happened to her. My heart stuttered. Is she? She's alive, Darlene assured me quickly. But not well. Richard has her practically under house arrest. Won't let any of us from the church visit anymore. Says she's too fragile. I gestured for Darlene to sit. The restraining order is a bunch of hogwash and everyone knows it, Darlene interrupted. That man has been controlling her for years, but this is different. He's escalating, and some of us are worried about what happens next. She reached into her large purse and pulled out a small leather-bound book. Coraline wanted me to give you this. Said if things got bad, you would need it. I took the book with trembling hands. It was my mother's journal, the one she'd kept faithfully since my father died. Opening it, I saw page after page of neat handwriting documenting her marriage to Richard. His controlling behaviors, his financial manipulations, his subtle threats, and eventually his violence. She's been writing it all down, Darlene explained. Said no one would believe her otherwise. I flipped to the most recent entry, dated just 3 days ago. Richard says he's found a buyer for the house. Says we're moving to Florida next month, somewhere quieter. I know what this means. He's isolating me completely. Once we're away from Atlanta, away from Ellie and my friends, there will be nothing left of me. I've seen his browser history, searches for nursing homes with minimal family visitation rights. He's going to put me away and take everything. I don't care about the money or the house, but I can't bear never seeing my Ellie again. If you're reading this, Ellie, remember the lesson you taught your students. Sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing when to fight and when to appear to surrender. The last line struck me forcefully. It was a reference to a curriculum I'd developed as principal, a leadership program for at-risk girls that emphasized strategic thinking over impulsive reaction. The philosophy had transformed our school's culture and eventually been adopted district-wide. She's telling me to be strategic. I murmured, more to myself than to Darlene. What's that, honey? I closed the journal carefully. My mother is reminding me of who I am. For 35 years, I had navigated the complex politics of public education, turning around failing schools by identifying systemic problems and implementing careful, methodical solutions. I'd faced down budget committees, angry parents, resistant teachers, and bureaucratic obstacles, always with a clear plan and unwavering determination. All these years, I've been letting Richard set the terms, I said, a new clarity emerging through my grief. I've been reactive, emotional, exactly what he expects from me. Darlene nodded. That man knows how to push buttons, sure enough. But he doesn't know everything about me. I continued, my mind racing now. He sees what he wants to see. a retired schoolteacher, a spinster daughter who couldn't find a husband. What Richard didn't know, what few people knew, was that my spinsterhood had been a choice. After watching my mother fall into Richard's controlling grasp following my father's death, I had made a conscious decision to remain independent. I'd channeled my energy into my career and my students, becoming not just an educator but a strategist, a negotiator, a force to be reckoned with in educational circles. I'd served on state education boards, advised governors on school reform, and quietly built a network of influential former students who now occupied positions throughout Atlanta's legal, medical, and business communities. I crossed to my home office and pulled out a leather portfolio, my war binder, as my assistant principal used to call it. Inside were contacts accumulated over decades: judges, lawyers, doctors, social workers, politicians, journalists. People who owed me favors, people who respected me, people who would help without asking questions. "Darlene," I said, returning to the living room, "I need you to get a message to my mother. Tell her I understand her note. Tell her to hold on. I'm coming for her, but not in the way Richard expects." Darlene raised an eyebrow. "What are you planning?" I smiled grimly. "A strategic surrender." Over the next week, I made calls, called in favors, and formulated a plan. I contacted Josephine again, but this time with a very different approach in mind. "You want to do what?" she asked incredulously when I explained my strategy. "I want to marry Richard," I repeated calmly. "Eleanor, that's insane. He's your stepfather. He's abusing your mother." "Exactly," I said. "And as his wife, I would have legal rights that I don't have as her daughter. Especially if something were to happen to my mother." Josephine stared at me, speechless for a moment. "You're suggesting that you marry Richard to, what? Beat him at his own game?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes you have to enter the lion's den to save the lamb. Even if this weren't ethically questionable, which it absolutely is, what makes you think Richard would agree to marry you?" I opened my mother's journal to a page I'd marked. Because according to this, Richard isn't just planning to move my mother to Florida and put her in a home. He's planning to have her declared incompetent so he can control her estate completely. But there's a problem with his plan. I pulled out another document, my parents' original will, drafted long before Richard entered the picture. My father left everything in trust to my mother for her lifetime, but with a condition. If she's ever declared mentally incompetent, the estate passes directly to me, bypassing any subsequent husband. Josephine took the will, scanning it quickly. "This is unusually prescient of your father." "Dad didn't trust easily," I explained. "He wanted to make sure Mom was protected if anything happened to him. So Richard needs to prevent the incompetency clause from triggering, while still gaining control of the assets," Josephine mused, following my logic. "But how does marrying you solve his problem?" "Richard doesn't know I've seen the will or Mom's journal. He believes I'm simply a desperate daughter trying to protect her mother." I leaned forward. What if I approached him with a deal? I drop all allegations of elder abuse, withdraw my objections to their move to Florida, and in exchange he helps me secure regular, guaranteed visitation with my mother. And the marriage part? That comes later. Once he believes I've surrendered, I'll find a way to make him see marriage to me as his idea, his perfect solution to the problem I present. Josephine shook her head slowly. "This is incredibly risky, Eleanor. And legally complicated. If your plan fails." "If my plan fails, I lose my mother forever," I said simply. "I'm willing to take the risk." With Josephine's reluctant assistance, I began laying the groundwork. First, I sent Richard a formal letter through his attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss an amicable resolution to our conflict. I emphasized my concerns about my mother's health and my desire to maintain a relationship with her, carefully avoiding any accusations of wrongdoing on his part. To my surprise, he agreed to meet at a neutral location, a conference room at his attorney's office. When I arrived, Richard was already seated, looking smug and perfectly at ease. "Eleanor," he greeted me with false warmth. "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses." I swallowed my revulsion and forced a contrite expression. "I've been reflecting on my behavior, Richard. I realize I may have overreacted to changes in Mom's situation. His eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't expected surrender so quickly. Well, I'm pleased to hear that. Coraline will be relieved. How is she? I asked, the question entirely genuine. Resting, he replied dismissively. The stress of your interference has taken its toll. Her doctor has prescribed sedatives to help her sleep. I bit back a retort about who was really causing her stress and nodded instead. I'm sorry to hear that. I never meant to upset her. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me. What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor? A truce, I said simply. I won't contest your decisions regarding Mom's care or finances. In return, I ask only for regular, guaranteed visitation rights. Visitation rights? Richard chuckled. She's not a child in a custody battle. Nevertheless, I persisted. I want a formal agreement. Weekly phone calls, monthly visits, supervised if you insist. Richard's eyes narrowed. And what about the allegations you've been spreading? The claims of financial exploitation. I forced myself to look down, as if ashamed. I was upset. I misunderstood the situation. I'm prepared to sign a statement retracting any such claims. The conference room was silent for a long moment as Richard considered my offer. Finally, he smiled, the predatory expression I'd come to dread. I think we can arrange something, he said smoothly. Though of course, once we move to Florida, visits will be less frequent. Florida. I feigned surprise, though I knew all about his plans from my mother's journal. When are you moving? Soon, he replied vaguely. Coraline needs a warmer climate for her arthritis. The doctor recommends it. I nodded, playing along. I understand. Perhaps quarterly visits then, once you've relocated. Richard agreed with suspicious ease, and within an hour his attorney had drafted a simple agreement outlining my visitation schedule and my retraction of all claims against Richard. I signed it without hesitation, knowing it was worthless for my ultimate purpose but valuable in establishing my apparent surrender. As we concluded the meeting, I made one final request. May I see my mother today? Just briefly, to let her know we've reached an understanding. Richard hesitated, then nodded magnanimously. I suppose that would be acceptable. Come by the house at 4. I'll have her ready for a short visit. I arrived at precisely 4 o'clock, bearing a small gift, my mother's favorite tea and a book of poetry we had both loved. Richard opened the door, ushering me inside with exaggerated courtesy. My mother sat in the living room, dressed neatly but looking frail and somewhat vacant. When she saw me, a flash of alertness crossed her face before she quickly masked it. Ellie, she said softly, Richard says you've come to apologize. I moved to embrace her, noting how she flinched slightly as I approached, a new habit born of fear. Yes, Mom. I wanted to tell you that Richard and I have worked things out. I'll be able to visit you regularly now. Richard hovered nearby, monitoring our interaction. Isn't that wonderful, Coraline? No more unpleasantness. My mother nodded mechanically. Very wonderful. I spent the next 30 minutes making bland conversation, discussing the weather, my garden, books I'd been reading. Anything but the reality of her situation. As I prepared to leave, I pressed the book of poetry into her hands. I've marked some passages I thought you'd enjoy, I told her, meeting her eyes meaningfully. She clutched the book to her chest. Thank you, dear. I'll read it tonight. What neither she nor Richard knew was that I'd marked specific poems whose first letters, when read in sequence, spelled out a message. Play along. Help coming. Trust me. As Richard showed me out, his hand on my elbow just a bit too tight, he said quietly, See how easy that was? Everyone's happier when you cooperate. I forced a smile. You're right, Richard. Sometimes surrender is the wisest choice. Over the next 2 weeks, I maintained the charade, visiting my mother under Richard's watchful eye, bringing small gifts, making innocuous conversation. Each time, I left subtle messages, a quote from my school leadership program, a reference to a shared memory, anything to remind her that I had a plan. Meanwhile, I continued my preparations. With Josephine's help, I documented every detail of Richard's financial manipulation, creating a comprehensive record of his abuse. I contacted a retired detective I'd known through my work with at-risk students, who agreed to conduct a discreet investigation into Richard's past. What he uncovered was more disturbing than I'd imagined. 2 previous wives, both elderly, both left penniless before their deaths under suspicious circumstances. I also reconnected with former students who now worked in banking, asking them to flag any unusual transactions in accounts connected to Richard or my mother. They reported back that large sums were indeed being moved into offshore accounts, classic preparation for disappearing with stolen money. The final piece fell into place when I learned through my network that Richard had been making inquiries about selling my mother's house, despite the fact that he legally couldn't do so without her signature. He was growing desperate, likely realizing that his window of opportunity was closing. It was time for the next phase of my plan. I requested another meeting with Richard, this time suggesting dinner at an upscale restaurant. He accepted, probably curious about what I wanted. Over expensive steaks and wine I barely touched, I carefully laid my trap. "Richard," I began hesitantly, "there's something I need to discuss with you. Something delicate." He set down his fork, instantly alert. "Oh, it's about Mom's financial situation." I lowered my voice. "I've been doing some research, and I've come across something that might complicate your plans." His expression remained neutral, but I noticed his hand tighten around his wine glass. "What plans would those be, Eleanor?" "The Florida move," I clarified smoothly. "The sale of the house. Mom's care arrangements." He studied me carefully. "I thought we had an agreement. You were going to stay out of our financial matters." "And I intend to," I assured him. "But I thought you should know about a clause in my father's will. A rather specific clause regarding Mom's mental competency." I watched as a flash of genuine alarm crossed his face before he controlled it. "What clause?" "If Mom is ever declared mentally incompetent," I explained, "all assets immediately transfer to me as sole heir, bypassing any subsequent husband." I took a sip of water. It's an unusual provision, but my father was a cautious man. Richard's jaw tightened. "I see. And you're telling me this because?" "Because I know you've been consulting with Dr. Patterson about Mom's declining mental state," I said bluntly. "I also know you've been talking to Elder Springs Assisted Living about their memory care unit." He didn't bother denying it. "Your mother needs specialized care. Care that I cannot provide at home." "Perhaps," I conceded. "But if she's placed in memory care, a formal competency evaluation will be required. And once that happens," I left the implication hanging. Richard sat back, reassessing me. "What exactly are you proposing, Eleanor?" "A partnership," I said simply. "I know you need Mom's assets. I know you've put considerable effort into acquiring them. I'm offering you a way to keep them without the risk of triggering the competency clause." His eyes narrowed. "What's in it for you?" "Mom stays in her home with proper care. No nursing facility, no declaration of incompetence. And I maintain full access to her." Richard considered this, clearly weighing his options. "And how exactly would this partnership work?" I leaned forward. "We establish a joint trust, with both of us as trustees. You get to manage the assets as you wish, with certain limitations I'll outline. I get to ensure Mom's well-being." "A trust can be contested," he pointed out. "Not if it's properly structured," I countered. "Josephine Harris, you remember my attorney friend, has considerable expertise in this area." Richard took a long sip of his wine, his mind clearly racing. I could almost see him calculating angles, looking for the trap in my offer. "I'll need to think about this," he finally said. I nodded, acting as if his hesitation was perfectly reasonable. "Of course. It's a significant decision." As we parted ways in the restaurant parking lot, I added casually, "Oh, and Richard? I've taken the liberty of preparing a detailed record of all your financial activities over the past 5 years. Just as insurance, you understand. Should anything happen to me or to Mom, that information will be released to the authorities." His face hardened. "Is that a threat, Eleanor?" I smiled pleasantly. "Just good business practice. I learned from the best after all." 3 days later, Richard called to arrange another meeting. This time, he suggested his attorney's office again, indicating he was taking my proposal seriously. When I arrived, both Richard and his attorney were waiting, along with another man introduced as Richard's financial advisor. They had clearly been strategizing. "We've considered your proposal," Richard began without preamble. "While the joint trust has some merit, we find it unnecessarily complicated." "I'm open to alternatives," I replied calmly. Richard glanced at his attorney, who nodded slightly. "We believe there's a simpler solution that achieves both our objectives." He paused dramatically. "Marriage." Though I had anticipated this exact outcome, I managed to look appropriately shocked. "Excuse me. Think about it, Eleanor," Richard continued smoothly. "As my wife, you would have legal rights to ensure your mother's care. And I would have assurance that the competency clause would never be triggered, since you would have no reason to invoke it against your own husband." I stared at him, pretending to be stunned by the suggestion. "You can't be serious." "It's quite logical, actually," his attorney interjected. "A marriage would create a legal relationship that provides protections for all parties involved." "But you're married to my mother," I protested. "A divorce would be simple enough to arrange," Richard said dismissively. "Coraline's condition makes her an unsuitable partner at this point. The courts would understand." I forced myself to appear hesitant, conflicted. "This is unexpected. I need time to consider." "Of course," Richard agreed magnanimously. "It's not a decision to make lightly. But do consider the advantages, Eleanor. Your mother remains in her home, receiving the care she needs. You maintain unlimited access to her. And the family assets remain in the family." I left the meeting in apparent turmoil, though inwardly I was grimly satisfied. Richard had taken the bait exactly as I'd anticipated. Now came the most difficult part of my plan, convincing my mother to go along with it. At my next supervised visit, while Richard was briefly called away to answer a phone call, I whispered urgently to my mother, "Mom, something's coming. Something that will seem terrible, but you have to trust me." Her eyes, clouded with whatever medication Richard was giving her, focused on me with effort. "What is it, Ellie?" "Richard is going to divorce you," I said bluntly, having no time to soften the blow. "And then he's going to propose to me." Her face crumpled in confusion. "What? Why would he?" "It's part of my plan," I assured her. "I need you to play along. Act heartbroken, but resigned. Don't fight it." "I don't understand," she murmured. "You don't need to," I squeezed her hand. "Just know that everything I'm doing is to save you." Richard returned before she could respond, but I saw something strengthen in her posture. A slight straightening of her shoulders, a new alertness in her eyes. My brilliant, resilient mother was still in there, fighting to understand, fighting to trust me. Events moved quickly after that. Within a week, Richard had filed for divorce, citing my mother's deteriorating mental condition as grounds for dissolution of the marriage. To the outside world, it appeared callous but practical. An elderly man unable to cope with his wife's decline. My mother, following my instructions, offered no resistance. When neighbors or church friends expressed outrage on her behalf, she simply said, "Richard needs to move on with his life." I understand. The divorce was finalized with unexpected speed, aided by Richard's connections in the legal community and my apparent cooperation. Throughout the process, I maintained my role as the dutiful daughter, supporting my mother while developing a cautious rapport with Richard. 2 months after the divorce, Richard made his move. Over another dinner, this time at his new apartment, he formally proposed. "We make a good team, Eleanor," he said, reaching for my hand across the table. "I've come to respect your intelligence, your practicality. We want the same things: security, comfort, a certain standard of living. Marriage between us makes sense." I withdrew my hand gently. "And my mother? What becomes of her?" "Coraline will continue to live in her home, with proper care, of course. As my former wife, I have no legal obligation to her, but as your mother." He smiled. "Well, I would naturally want to ensure her comfort." "I need more than vague assurances, Richard," I said firmly. "I need legal guarantees of her welfare before I consider your proposal." He nodded, respecting my negotiating position. "Draw up whatever documents you feel necessary." I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that satisfies us both. Working with Josephine, I prepared a comprehensive prenuptial agreement that included detailed provisions for my mother's care and financial support. Richard's attorney objected to several clauses, but Richard overruled him, eager to secure the marriage and with it, continued access to my mother's assets without triggering the competency clause. The final step was perhaps the cruelest. Explaining to my mother that I was marrying her ex-husband, I arranged a private visit, assuring Richard that I needed to prepare her gently for the news. "Mom," I began once we were alone in her living room. "The time has come. Richard has proposed, and I've accepted." She looked at me steadily, more clear-eyed than I'd seen her in months. "You're going through with it, then?" "It's the only way," I said softly. "Once I'm his wife, I'll have legal authority over your care. I can protect you from him." "But at what cost, Ellie?" She reached for my hand. "The thought of you married to that man." "It won't be for long," I assured her. "Just long enough to execute the next phase of the plan." She shook her head. "I don't know how you can bear it." "I can bear anything to keep you safe," I replied simply. The wedding was set for the following month, a small civil ceremony at the courthouse. Richard, ever conscious of appearances, invited a few business associates and neighbors to witness the unlikely union. My mother would attend as well, a final cruel twist of the knife that Richard seemed to relish. And so we come full circle, to the moment where our story began. Me standing before a judge, about to say I do to the man who had systematically abused my mother for 30 years. As Richard drove us away from the courthouse, the three of us sat in suffocating silence. The newly married couple and the ex-wife, now mother of the bride. My mother stared out the window, her face a mask of dignified suffering. Richard wore a self-satisfied smile, certain his elaborate scheme had succeeded. I twisted the simple gold band on my finger, a physical reminder of the Faustian bargain I had made. But beneath my outward display of reluctant submission, a cold determination burned. This was no longer just about protecting my mother, it had become something larger. Through my investigation into Richard's past, I had discovered other victims. Elderly women whose life savings had disappeared, whose children had been alienated, whose final years had been spent in confusion and fear. Richard Caldwell was a predator who had been operating unchecked for decades, protected by his veneer of respectability and the vulnerability of his chosen targets. My personal crusade had evolved into a mission of justice for all of Richard's victims, past and present. Marriage to him gave me unprecedented access to his home, his records, his private affairs. Access I intended to use to build an irrefutable case against him. But I wasn't alone in this fight. Throughout my career, I had championed programs for elder abuse prevention, serving on boards and advisory committees. Now those connections formed a secret network of support for my dangerous undertaking. Detective Marcus Washington, no relation, now retired from the Atlanta PD, had been documenting Richard's activities for weeks. Dr. Lydia Chun, a geriatric specialist who had helped me establish health screenings for elderly parents of my students, stood ready to conduct a proper evaluation of my mother, free from Richard's influence. Judge Terrence Maxwell, whose daughter I had mentored through law school, was prepared to fast-track legal proceedings when the time came. 2 days after the wedding, Richard announced his intention to move us all, himself, me, and my mother, to a spacious home he had purchased in a gated community in Boca Raton, Florida. "The closing is next week," he informed me over breakfast. "I've already arranged for the movers." "So soon?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "I haven't given notice at my volunteer positions." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Those are easily replaced. The important thing is getting your mother settled before her condition deteriorates further." "And what about her doctors here? Her treatment plan?" "I've found excellent specialists in Florida," he assured me. "Top-notch care, the best money can buy." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Our money now, of course." The move to Florida would complicate my plans considerably. Once outside Georgia, my carefully cultivated network would be less effective. The evidence I was gathering might be subject to different legal jurisdictions. Most importantly, my mother would be further isolated in unfamiliar surroundings, making her even more dependent on Richard's care. and more vulnerable to his manipulation. I needed to accelerate my timeline. That evening, I met secretly with Detective Washington in a coffee shop across town. "He's moving faster than we anticipated," the detective said grimly after I explained the situation. "Probably got spooked by something. Predators like him can sense when the hunt is closing in." "How much more time do you need?" I asked. He sighed, running a hand over his graying hair. "Ideally, another month. We've documented the financial fraud pretty thoroughly, but the elder abuse charges need more substantiation. Without your mother's testimony." "She'll testify," I said firmly. "Once she's safe from him. Once the medication he's been giving her is out of her system." "And what about you, Eleanor? You're living with this man now. You're his wife." The detective's concern was evident. "That puts you in a vulnerable position." I straightened my shoulders. "I can handle Richard." "Maybe," he conceded. "But maybe he's handling you. Men like him, they're always 3 steps ahead. Just be careful. And take this." He slid a small device across the table. "Emergency beacon. Looks like a normal key fob, but press these buttons together. It sends an alert with your GPS location." I pocketed the device, touched by his concern. "1 week," I said. "That's all I can give you. After that, we move against him, ready or not." The detective nodded reluctantly. "I'll push as hard as I can. In the meantime, start documenting everything. Conversations, financial decisions, his treatment of your mother. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case." As I drove home, a new worry gnawed at me. What if Richard suspected my true intentions? What if this hasty move to Florida wasn't just about isolating my mother, but about removing me from my support network as well? For the first time since embarking on this dangerous path, I felt a flicker of genuine fear. I had cast myself as the hunter, but what if I was actually the prey? My fears seemed justified when I returned home to find Richard in my mother's room, supervising as she packed her belongings. "There you are," he said pleasantly. "I was wondering where you'd disappeared to." "Just running errands," I replied, noting with alarm that my mother appeared unusually sedated, her movements slow and uncoordinated. Richard's tone was skeptical. "Well, I've decided we should leave sooner. The house in Florida is ready now, and I've scheduled the movers for the day after tomorrow." 2 days. I kept my voice level despite my internal panic. "That's hardly enough time to." "I've handled everything," he interrupted smoothly. "Your mother's medical records have been transferred, the utilities are arranged, and I've even found a few local organizations that might interest you. Book clubs, garden societies, that sort of thing." His smile was knife-sharp. After all, I want my new wife to be happy in our new home. There was something in his eyes, a calculating gleam that made my skin crawl. He knew, perhaps not everything, but enough to sense that I was working against him. "That's very thoughtful," I managed. "I'm a thoughtful man," he replied. "Ask anyone. Ask your mother." He turned to her. "Isn't that right, Coraline? Haven't I always taken good care of you?" My mother looked up slowly, her eyes struggling to focus. "Yes, Richard. Always." "Mom, you look tired," I said, moving to her side. "Why don't you rest while I help with the packing?" Richard's hand closed around my wrist, his grip painfully tight. "No need. I've hired people to finish up tomorrow. Coraline should keep packing. The activity is good for her cognitive function." He smiled benignly. "Doctor's orders." "Which doctor?" I challenged, unable to contain myself. His grip tightened. "Dr. Patterson, of course. Your mother's trusted physician for years. He's concerned about her rapid decline." Richard's voice lowered. "As her daughter, you should be too." The implicit threat was clear. If I opposed him too openly, he would accelerate his plans to have my mother declared incompetent. While our marriage prevented him from benefiting directly from such a declaration, it wouldn't stop him from placing her in a facility where she could be controlled and isolated. I needed to reach Detective Washington, to tell him our timeline had changed drastically. But Richard seemed determined not to let me out of his sight. "I thought we might have dinner together tonight," he announced. "Just the 2 of us. A proper honeymoon dinner, since we've postponed our actual honeymoon until after the move. I'm not really hungry, I hedged. I insist, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I've made reservations at La Maison for 8. Or something nice. He finally released my wrist, leaving behind angry red marks. And Eleanor? Leave your cell phone at home. I want your undivided attention tonight. After he left the room, I turned to my mother. Mom, what has he been giving you? You're barely staying awake. She struggled to focus on me. New pills. Says they're for anxiety. So many pills now. Listen to me, I said urgently. Don't take any more pills. Hide them under your tongue, spit them out when he's not looking. Can you do that? She nodded weakly. Trying. Already trying. Good. And Mom? I gripped her shoulders gently. Whatever happens in the next couple of days, remember that I love you. Everything I'm doing is to protect you. A tear slipped down her weathered cheek. I know, baby. I know. I spent the next hour frantically trying to contact Detective Washington, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I left a coded message we had agreed upon for emergencies. The recital has been moved up. New date is Thursday. Thursday, the day after tomorrow, when Richard planned to move us to Florida. With no way of knowing if the detective had received my message, I had to assume I was on my own. I quickly gathered what evidence I could. Photos of my mother's overmedication, copies of financial documents I found in Richard's home office, recordings of his veiled threats. I was hiding these materials in a secret compartment I'd created in my suitcase when Richard appeared in the bedroom doorway. What are you doing? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. I closed the suitcase smoothly. Just starting to pack. Since we're leaving so soon. He didn't sound convinced. I thought I'd come home early to help you prepare for dinner. That's thoughtful, I said, echoing his earlier words. I am thoughtful. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. And observant. For instance, I've observed that you've been making a lot of phone calls lately, having a lot of secret meetings. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral, saying goodbye to friends, making arrangements for my absence. Is that so? He moved closer, invading my personal space. You wouldn't be plotting against your new husband, would you, Eleanor? Of course not, I said evenly. Why would I do that? Indeed, why would you? His smile was chilling. Unless, perhaps, your agreement to marry me wasn't as sincere as you claimed. Unless this whole arrangement was some elaborate scheme to interfere with my plans for your mother. I don't know what you're talking about, I maintained, though my palms were sweating now. Richard's hand shot out suddenly, grasping my chin and forcing me to look at him. Don't play games with me, Eleanor. I've been watching you. The furtive phone calls. The meetings with that retired cop. Did you think I wouldn't notice? I jerked away from his grasp. Take your hands off me. Or what? He challenged. You'll call the police? Report me for abusing my wife. He laughed coldly. Who do you think they'll believe? The respected community elder with a history of charitable work, or the spinster daughter with a documented history of making false allegations? I have evidence, I said, abandoning pretense. Documentation of everything you've done, to my mother, to your previous wives. Financial records, medical records. Circumstantial, he dismissed. And irrelevant. By this time tomorrow, all those records will be destroyed, and you, my dear, will be accompanying me and your mother to Florida as planned. His expression hardened, though perhaps with a slightly adjusted attitude. Your mother's not the only one who benefits from proper medication. The threat sent ice through my veins. You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't I? He moved to the door. Be ready for dinner by 7:30. We have much to discuss about our future together. He paused in the doorway. Oh, and Eleanor? Don't bother trying to contact your detective friend again. He had an unfortunate accident this afternoon. Nothing life-threatening, just a minor car collision that's left him indisposed for a few days. After he left, I sank onto the bed, trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. Richard had outmaneuvered me at every turn. He knew about my investigation, had neutralized my primary ally, and was now threatening to drug me as he had my mother. The stakes had escalated beyond anything I had anticipated. This was no longer just about protecting my mother or achieving justice for Richard's victims. It was now a desperate fight for my own freedom and safety as well. I needed a new plan, immediately. For 20 minutes, I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, my mind racing through scenarios, each one more desperate than the last. Escape seemed impossible. Richard would surely be watching the house. Going to the police directly was risky without Detective Washington's support. Richard's community standing and my apparent history of false accusations would undermine my credibility. Then my eyes fell on the wedding band on my finger, and clarity cut through my panic like a beam of light through darkness. I had become so caught up in the dangers of my position that I'd forgotten its primary advantage. As Richard's wife, I had legal rights and access that no one else possessed. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think systematically, as I had taught generations of students to do. First, identify the objective. In this case, 3 objectives: protect my mother, gather irrefutable evidence against Richard, and escape his control before he could move us to Florida. Second, assess available resources. I mentally inventoried everything at my disposal: my legal status as Richard's wife, my mother's journal documenting years of abuse, the financial records I'd already copied, my network of allies, even if temporarily diminished, and perhaps most importantly, Richard's own arrogance and underestimation of me. Third, develop a strategic plan with contingencies for likely obstacles. I reached for the burner phone I'd hidden in the lining of my purse, a precaution that now seemed prescient. Detective Washington was unavailable, but I had other allies. I sent text messages to 3 key contacts: Josephine, Dr. Chun, and Darlene. To Josephine: emergency. Arnaud's. Moving us to FL Thursday. Need legal intervention. Prenup violation claim ready. To Dr. Chun: need immediate wellness check for mother. Possible overmedication. Tomorrow 10 a.m. To Darlene: church emergency committee meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. Bring the prayer warriors. Each message activated a different aspect of my contingency plan. Josephine would prepare legal documents claiming Richard had violated our prenuptial agreement, potentially freezing assets and delaying our move. Dr. Chin would arrive with medical authority to assess my mother's condition, creating an official record of potential abuse. And Darlene, dear fierce Darlene, would rally the church community for the prayer meeting we had coded as a public intervention. With these pieces in motion, I turned to the final, most dangerous part of my plan: a direct confrontation with Richard at dinner that night. I dressed carefully, selecting a conservative navy dress that projected calm authority, my old principal's uniform, from years of handling difficult parents and school board members. I applied makeup precisely, covering the fear in my eyes with a mask of composed dignity. At precisely 7:30, I descended the stairs to find Richard waiting in the foyer, also impeccably dressed. "You look lovely," he said, his tone appreciative but possessive. "I made the right choice in a second wife." "Thank you," I replied evenly. "Shall we check on my mother before we go?" "She's resting," he said dismissively. "The nurse will look in on her." Nurse? This was news to me. "You hired a nurse?" "Just for the evening," Richard explained smoothly. "I wanted us to enjoy our dinner without worrying about Coraline. Mrs. Porter is very experienced with confused patients." A new worry gnawed at me. Who was this Mrs. Porter, and what instructions had Richard given her? "I'd still like to say goodnight to my mother," I insisted. Richard's smile tightened. "Another time, perhaps. Our reservation awaits." He guided me firmly to the car, his hand at the small of my back, outwardly gentlemanly, but with clear undertones of control. As we drove to the restaurant, he filled the silence with pleasant conversation about the Florida house, the amenities of the community, his plans for our life there. I responded with appropriate murmurs of interest, all while my mind raced ahead to the confrontation I was planning. La Maison was one of Atlanta's most exclusive restaurants, dim and intimate with well-spaced tables ensuring privacy. Richard clearly intended our conversation to remain private, unaware that this actually served my purposes. After we were seated and had ordered, Richard raised his wine glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes coolly assessing my reaction. I raised my glass but didn't drink. Before we toast to anything, Richard, I think we should have an honest conversation. His eyebrow arched. Honest? How refreshing. Please do begin. I set my glass down carefully. I know about Barbara Emmett and Lucille Donovan. The names of his previous wives hung in the air between us. For just a moment, Richard's composed facade slipped, revealing genuine surprise before his mask returned. My first and second wives, he acknowledged. What about them? Barbara died under suspicious circumstances after changing her will in your favor, I said calmly. Lucille survived you, but lost everything. And then there was my mother, who would have suffered the same fate if I hadn't intervened. Richard sipped his wine unhurriedly. Ancient history, Eleanor. And largely fictional, I might add. Barbara's death was ruled accidental. Lucille's financial problems were of her own making. We both know the truth, I countered. Just as we both know why you married me. It wasn't for companionship or even convenience. It was because you needed to neutralize the competency clause in my father's will. He set down his glass, studying me with new interest. You're more direct than I expected. I thought we'd dance around these matters for weeks, maintaining our polite fiction. I don't have weeks, I said. You're moving us to Florida in 2 days. Yes. His smile returned. A fresh start. For you, perhaps. Another hunting ground with new prey. His expression hardened. Careful, Eleanor. Such accusations between husband and wife are unbecoming. I'm not making accusations, I replied. I'm stating facts. Facts that are now documented and in the hands of multiple trusted associates. I leaned forward slightly. If anything happens to me or my mother, that documentation goes directly to the authorities. Richard's laugh was genuinely amused. The classic insurance policy? Really, Eleanor, I expected more creativity from you. It's not just documentation, I continued steadily. It's testimony. From Barbara's children, who were suspicious but could never prove anything. From Lucille herself, who's still alive in a nursing home in Tennessee. From the bank employees who questioned your financial management but were silenced. From the nurses who noticed my mother's unusual symptoms whenever you increased her medication. With each detail, I watched Richard's amusement fade, replaced by calculating assessment. You've been busy, he finally said. I had 30 years to watch you destroy my mother, I replied. And a career spent protecting the vulnerable. Did you really think I would enter this marriage without a strategy? The waiter arrived with our appetizers, forcing a pause in our confrontation. When he departed, Richard's demeanor had shifted subtly, less dismissive, more wary. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. A renegotiation of terms, I said, adopting the businesslike tone he seemed to respect. You want financial security. I want my mother's safety and freedom. I believe we can structure an arrangement that achieves both objectives without resorting to unpleasantness. Richard picked up his fork, spearing a scallop with deliberate precision. I'm listening. First, the Florida move is canceled. My mother remains in her home in Atlanta, with proper medical care, real care, not over-medication. Second, you transfer majority control of all financial assets back to my mother, with me as co-trustee. You retain a generous monthly allowance and the vacation property in Hilton Head. He chewed thoughtfully before responding. And in exchange? My silence, I said simply. No police, no prosecution, no public scandal. You maintain your reputation and a comfortable lifestyle. Your silence isn't worth that much, he countered. Perhaps not alone, I acknowledged. But combined with your freedom, your continued standing in the community, the alternative is prosecution for elder abuse, financial fraud, possibly even investigation into Barbara's death. Richard's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. You don't have enough evidence for any of that. I reached into my clutch and removed a small digital recorder, placing it on the table between us. Why don't we listen to what you've said just in this conversation, and then reassess who's bluffing? For the first time, genuine alarm flashed across his face. He reached for the recorder, But I was faster, slipping it back into my purse. That's just a copy, I informed him. The original transmission has already been sent to my attorney. This was a calculated bluff. The recorder was real, but it wasn't transmitting anywhere. Richard, however, had no way of knowing that. This is blackmail, he hissed. This is negotiation, I corrected. Between equals. Something you're not accustomed to with women, I know. Our main courses arrived, creating another pause in the increasingly tense conversation. Richard used the interruption to regain his composure, his expression smoothing back into calculated charm. You surprise me, Eleanor, he said once the waiter had gone. I underestimated you. Most men do, I replied evenly. He cut into his steak, seemingly relaxed once more. Your terms are unacceptable in their current form, but I'm willing to consider a compromise. For the next hour, we negotiated like business adversaries, discussing percentages, living arrangements, and legal frameworks. I held firm on my core demands. My mother's safety, her continued residence in Atlanta, and majority control of her assets. Richard fought hardest for the Florida move, revealing just how important it was to his plans, which only strengthened my resolve to prevent it. By the time dessert arrived, we had reached a tentative agreement. Richard would retain a 30% interest in my mother's estate, and a generous monthly stipend. The Florida house would be sold, with profits split equally. My mother would remain in Atlanta under the care of doctors of my choosing, with Richard maintaining visitation rights as her ex-husband. I'll have my attorney draw up the papers tomorrow, I said, declining the dessert menu. We can sign them before noon. Richard's smile was tight. So efficient. One might almost think you had this planned all along. Not all along, I admitted. But I've learned from watching you, Richard. The importance of having contingencies, of thinking several moves ahead. As we drove home in silence, I maintained my composure, but inside, I was vibrating with tension. The negotiation had gone better than I'd dared hope, but I didn't trust Richard's apparent capitulation. A man like him, controlling, narcissistic, accustomed to dominance, wouldn't surrender so easily. My suspicion was confirmed when we arrived home, and found the house eerily quiet. Where's the nurse? I asked immediately. And my mother? Mrs. Porter had to leave early, Richard said casually, hanging up his coat. And Coraline was sleeping so peacefully, we decided not to disturb her. I hurried upstairs to my mother's room, my heart pounding. The bed was empty, the covers neatly turned down as if waiting for an occupant. Mom, I called, checking the adjoining bathroom. Nothing. I turned to find Richard standing in the doorway, watching my growing panic with detached interest. Where is she? I demanded. Safe, he replied simply. Receiving the care she needs. Cold fear gripped me. What have you done? Simply taken precautions, he said, his mask of reasonable compromise falling away. Did you really think I would leave Coraline here as a witness against me? That I would sign away everything I've worked decades to secure? We had an agreement, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. We had a conversation, he corrected. One that proved to me that you're too dangerous to keep close, Eleanor. Your mother has been transferred to a private care facility, very exclusive, very discreet. By this time tomorrow she'll be officially evaluated and, I expect, declared incompetent. The competency clause, I reminded him. If she's declared incompetent. If she's declared incompetent while still married to me, the assets go to you, he interrupted. But she's no longer married to me. She's divorced. And the clause doesn't specify what happens in that case. His smile was triumphant. A legal gray area that my attorneys assure me will take years to resolve in court. Horror washed over me as I realized his strategy. He had never intended to honor our dinner negotiation. While we were at the restaurant, he had moved my mother to an unknown location. Now he planned to have her declared incompetent, creating a legal quagmire that would tie up her assets indefinitely, during which time he, as my husband, would maintain considerable influence over them. You won't get away with this, I said, reaching for my phone. I already have, he replied confidently. And do feel free to call the police. I've simply arranged appropriate medical care for my former wife, with the full support of her doctor. There's no crime in that. Dr. Patterson. I guess bitterly. Your co-conspirator. Richard shrugged. A colleague who understands Coraline's condition. Now I suggest you get some rest. We have a busy day tomorrow, preparing for our move. I'm not going anywhere with you, I declared. Oh, but you are. His tone hardened. You're my wife now, Eleanor. For better or worse. He reached into his pocket and removed a small pill bottle. I think you'll find it easier to cooperate with a little help. The same medication has made your mother much more manageable. I backed away as he advanced, my mind racing for options. The emergency beacon Detective Washington had given me was in my purse, still downstairs. My burner phone was in the same purse. I had no weapons, no direct means of defense. But I did have one advantage that Richard consistently underestimated. Decades of experience managing crisis situations in a school system with limited resources. Wait, I said, holding up my hands. Before you do something irreversible, you should know that I've activated my contingency plan. He paused, pill bottle still in hand. More bluffs, Eleanor? Dr. Lydia Chim will be here at 10 a.m. tomorrow for a wellness check on my mother. I informed him. When she doesn't find her, she'll immediately report a missing vulnerable adult to the authorities. Richard's expression didn't change. Cancel it. I can't. It's an official medical appointment. And when Dr. Chin reports my mother missing, the police will ask questions. Neighbors will mention the unusual late-night activity at our house. The nurse you hired, Mrs. Porter, will be interviewed. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face. Mrs. Porter is well paid for her discretion. Is she prepared for a police investigation? For potential charges as an accessory to elder abuse? For losing her nursing license? I pressed my advantage. And that's just the beginning. Josephine Harris has already filed preliminary papers questioning our prenuptial agreement on grounds of coercion. By noon tomorrow, all our assets will be temporarily frozen pending investigation. Richard's confidence visibly wavered. You're making this up. Am I? I challenged. You've been so focused on controlling my mother and me that you've ignored what I've been doing in the background. Check your email. Call your bank. See if you can access your accounts right now. This was another bluff. Josephine hadn't actually filed anything yet. But doubt had crept into Richard's expression. Even if that's true, he said, recovering. It's a minor inconvenience. Temporary freezes are easily lifted. Not when they're accompanied by evidence of systematic fraud, I countered. Not when multiple witnesses are prepared to testify. Not when the pattern extends back decades to Barbara and Lucille. I could see him recalculating, reassessing the situation. Richard was nothing if not pragmatic. If the risk outweighed the reward, he would adjust his strategy. Tell me where my mother is, I said, pressing my momentary advantage. Return her home safely, and perhaps we can still salvage some version of our agreement from dinner. He studied me for a long moment, weighing options. Finally, he pocketed the pill bottle. She's at Shady Grove Retreat, a private facility in Dunwoody. They're expecting you to make a scene, so security has been instructed not to let you in. Call them, I demanded. Tell them to release her to my custody immediately. Richard laughed, a cold sound without humor. Why would I do that when I have the upper hand again? Your mother is secure, your threats are largely unverifiable, and as my wife, you have limited legal recourse against me without implicating yourself in this conspiracy you fabricated. It was time for my final card, the one I'd hoped not to play until all my other plans were in place. Because of the press conference scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow, I said quietly. This caught his attention. What press conference? The one where several of your former colleagues from Piedmont Bank will discuss the irregularities they observed in accounts you managed. Where Barbara's daughter will question the investigation into her mother's death. Where I'll detail the systematic abuse of my mother. Richard's face darkened. You wouldn't dare. Your reputation would suffer, yes, I acknowledged. But yours would be destroyed. Completely and irrevocably. Everything you've built over decades, the respect, the connections, the image of the upstanding community leader, gone in an hour of damning testimony broadcast across local, and perhaps even national news. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze steadily. You might eventually disprove some allegations. You might avoid criminal charges through your connections. You might even retain some assets through legal maneuvering. But you will never recover your reputation. And for a man like you, Richard, isn't that the most valuable asset of all? The silence between us stretched taut as a wire. I could almost see him calculating the potential damage, weighing it against the benefits of continuing his plan. You're bluffing again, he finally said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Call Channel 5. I suggested. Ask about tomorrow's special report on elder financial abuse featuring Richard Caldwell. The promos are already running. This too was a bluff, but a calculated one. Local news would jump at such a story if offered, especially with the participants I had lined up. Richard's composure finally cracked. You would destroy yourself just to bring me down? To protect my mother? Without hesitation, I replied. You've never understood that, Richard. You see relationships as transactions, as opportunities for gain. You've never comprehended what someone might do for love. He stared at me with something almost like wonder. You planned this from the beginning. The marriage, the prenup, all of it, just to trap me. I learned from watching you, I said simply. Now make the call. Tell Shady Grove to release my mother. Then we'll discuss terms. Richard's hand shook slightly as he took out his phone. For the first time in our long acquaintance, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not of legal consequences or financial loss, but of public humiliation. Of being exposed as the predator he truly was. He made the call, his voice clipped and controlled as he instructed the facility to release Coraline Washington into her daughter's custody immediately. Your mother will be discharged within the hour, he said after hanging up. Now call off your press conference. When my mother is safely home, I countered. And after we've signed a new agreement, one drafted by my attorney, with terms that ensure both her safety and her financial security permanently. Richard's shoulders slumped in uncharacteristic defeat. You've won, Eleanor. Is that what you want to hear? This isn't about winning, I said. It's about justice. For my mother, for Barbara, for Lucille, and for any other women you might have targeted in the future. I left Richard standing in my mother's empty room, and went downstairs to call Dr. Chun and arrange for her to meet us at Shady Grove. As I reached for my purse, my hand brushed against the emergency beacon Detective Washington had given me. I wouldn't need it now, but its presence reminded me that I hadn't been fighting alone, even when it felt like I was. The strategic comeback I had engineered wasn't just about clever planning or leveraging legal knowledge. It was about recognizing that the same community Richard had fooled for years could become a powerful force against him when properly organized. It was about understanding that his need for public esteem was as vital to him as oxygen, and therefore his most exploitable vulnerability. Most of all, it was about remembering who I was at my core, not just a daughter or a retired principal, but a woman who had spent her life protecting others, who knew how to build coalitions, who understood that true power often lies in perception. Richard had seen me as an obstacle to overcome. He never considered that I might be a formidable opponent in my own right. The next morning dawned with a tense calm, like the eye of a hurricane. My mother was home, safely sleeping in her own bed after Dr. Chun had examined her and begun the process of weaning her off the unnecessary medications Richard had been giving her. Richard had retreated to the guest room. A temporary truce established while we awaited Josephine's arrival with the new agreement. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in delicate pinks and golds. Despite the victory of the previous night, I remained vigilant. Richard had conceded the battle, but a man like him, proud, manipulative, accustomed to controlling others, wouldn't surrender the war without a final stand. My instincts proved correct when Richard appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed in one of his expensive suits, his manner almost jovial. Good morning, Eleanor, he greeted me, as if our confrontation the night before had never happened. Beautiful day, isn't it? I nodded cautiously, watching as he poured himself coffee and took the seat across from me. I've been thinking about our situation, he continued conversationally. And I believe I may have overreacted last night. Overreacted? I repeated, disbelief coloring my tone. Yes, he said smoothly. The stress of the wedding, the divorce from Coraline, the Florida plans, it all became rather overwhelming. I wasn't thinking clearly. I remained silent, waiting for the trap I knew was coming. Your concerns about Coraline's care are completely valid, he continued. She should remain in her home, with proper medical attention. And the financial arrangements should certainly reflect her needs and your position as her daughter. His reasonable tone set alarm bells ringing. This sudden capitulation was too easy, too complete. I'm glad we agree, I said carefully. In fact, Richard added, I've taken the liberty of calling my attorney this morning. He's bringing over a revised agreement that I believe addresses all your concerns. He should be here within the hour. My wariness increased. Josephine will be here at 10 with the agreement we discussed. Richard waved a dismissive hand. No need for 2 lawyers and 2 sets of documents. Mine will cover everything we discussed. I'd prefer to wait for Josephine, I insisted. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. As you wish. Though it seems an unnecessary complication. We fell into strained silence, each of us calculating our next moves like chess players in the final game of a tournament. The doorbell rang at 9:15. Richard rose smoothly. That will be Martin with the papers. Shall we? I followed him to the foyer, maintaining a careful distance. Richard opened the door to reveal not only his attorney, a silver-haired man with a practiced smile, but also Dr. Patterson, Richard's medical ally, and a uniformed police officer. My heart sank as Richard's strategy became immediately clear. Officer Davis, Richard greeted the policeman warmly. Thank you for coming so promptly. The officer nodded, his expression professionally neutral. Mr. Caldwell, is this your wife? Yes, Richard confirmed. Eleanor Caldwell, formerly Washington. Mrs. Caldwell, the officer addressed me directly. I'm here regarding a complaint of elder abuse and unlawful imprisonment. Before I could respond, Richard interjected smoothly. As I explained on the phone, officer, my wife removed her mother from a licensed care facility against medical advice last night. Dr. Patterson can confirm that Coraline Washington requires specialized care for her advancing dementia. Dr. Patterson, a thin man with cold eyes, nodded. Mrs. Washington's condition necessitates constant supervision and medication management. Removing her from Shady Grove potentially endangers her health. I found my voice, anger cutting through my shock. That's absurd. My mother was placed in that facility without her consent. She was being overmedicated to make her compliant. Mrs. Caldwell has been making these allegations for some time, Dr. Patterson said to the officer, his tone dripping with professional concern. It's unfortunately common for family members to deny the reality of a loved one's cognitive decline. The officer looked between us, clearly uncertain. Is Mrs. Washington here now? Yes, I confirmed. She's resting. Dr. Lydia Chen examined her last night and is supervising her recovery from unnecessary sedation. Dr. Chen? The officer questioned. A geriatric specialist, I explained. She's documented my mother's condition and the inappropriate medications prescribed by Dr. Patterson. Richard sighed theatrically. More unfounded accusations. Officer Davis, my wife has become increasingly paranoid about her mother's care. First accusing me of financial exploitation, now these medical claims. Martin has the relevant documents showing that all financial and medical decisions were made appropriately and legally. The attorney stepped forward, opening his briefcase. I have copies of Mrs. Washington's power of attorney forms appointing Mr. Caldwell as her healthcare proxy, as well as the medical evaluation conducted by Dr. Patterson documenting her cognitive impairment. I recognized the strategy immediately. Richard was attempting to use his connections and prepared documentation to cast me as the unstable one. The daughter unable to accept her mother's decline. It was clever, and had I been unprepared, it might have worked. Fortunately, I wasn't unprepared. Officer Davis, I said calmly, before you review those documents, I'd like you to speak with Detective Marcus Washington, no relation to my mother. He's been investigating Mr. Caldwell's pattern of elder abuse for several weeks. The officer's expression changed slightly. Marcus Washington? From violent crimes? Formerly, I confirmed. He's retired now, but still consults with the department. He should be here momentarily along with my attorney, Josephine Harris. Richard's confident expression faltered briefly. This is becoming absurd, Eleanor. Officer Davis doesn't have time for your parade of supposed witnesses. As if on cue, another car pulled into the driveway. Detective Washington emerged, followed by Josephine and, to my surprise, a woman I recognized from photographs as Barbara Emmett's daughter, Jennifer. Richard paled visibly at the sight of Jennifer. What is she doing here? Adding her testimony to the record, I said quietly. The dynamic in the foyer shifted palpably as Detective Washington approached, nodding to Officer Davis with the easy familiarity of longtime colleagues. Dave, he greeted the officer. Thanks for coming. I see Mr. Caldwell has already begun presenting his version of events. Officer Davis straightened slightly. Marcus, didn't realize you were involved in this. Officially, I'm not, the detective clarified. Unofficially, I've been building a case file that I think you'll find interesting. He handed the officer a thick folder. Financial records showing systematic theft from Coraline Washington's accounts. Medical records indicating prescription of unnecessary psychotropic medications. And statements from previous victims with strikingly similar experiences. Jennifer Emmett stepped forward. Her resemblance to photographs I'd seen of her mother striking. Richard Caldwell married my mother in 1987. Within a year, she had changed her will in his favor. Within 2 years, she was dead from a fall that was never properly investigated. Richard's attorney attempted to intervene. These allegations are completely irrelevant to the current situation and potentially defamatory. They establish pattern in practice, Josephine countered, stepping into the foyer. Critical elements in cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Officer Davis, looking increasingly uncomfortable, turned to Richard. Mr. Caldwell, given the nature of these allegations, I think it's best if we continue this discussion at the station. This is preposterous, Richard sputtered, his composed facade cracking. These are vindictive fabrications from a bitter stepdaughter, who resented my marriage to her mother. Then you should have no problem addressing them formally, the detective said calmly. With your attorney present, of course. The confrontation might have ended there, with Richard being escorted to the police station to answer questions, his scheme thwarted by my preparation. But Richard, cornered and desperate, had one final, devastating card to play. This is all a setup, he declared, his voice rising. Eleanor isn't protecting her mother. She's after Coraline's money herself. Why else would she have married me 3 days ago? The revelation hung in the air, creating exactly the confusion Richard had hoped for. Officer Davis turned to me bewildered. You married your stepfather? Before I could explain, my mother's voice came from the top of the stairs. She married him to protect me. All eyes turned to see Coraline Washington standing on the landing, leaning on the banister but straight-backed and clear-eyed. The unnecessary medications were beginning to wear off. And though she still moved carefully, her gaze was sharp and focused. Mom, I said, alarmed. You should be resting. She shook her head, making her way slowly down the stairs. I moved to help her, but she waved me off, determined to make this descent on her own. I've been resting for too long, she said firmly. Hiding, really. Pretending I didn't see what was happening because I was too ashamed to admit I'd been fooled. Richard's expression hardened. Coraline, you're confused. The medication. I haven't taken your medication since yesterday morning, she interrupted, reaching the bottom of the stairs. And my mind hasn't been this clear in months. She turned to Officer Davis. Young man, I want to file charges against Richard Caldwell for theft, fraud, assault, and attempted kidnapping. Assault, the officer repeated. My mother pushed up her sleeve, revealing fading bruises on her wrist and arm. He didn't like it when I questioned the pills, or the bank statements, or the new will he wanted me to sign. Dr. Patterson attempted to intervene. Mrs. Washington is clearly experiencing paranoid delusions, a common symptom of her condition. My condition, my mother cut him off, was believing that the respected doctor my husband brought into our home had my best interests at heart. My condition was trusting a man who saw me not as a partner, but as a bank account. My condition was shame at being duped, at having ignored my daughter's warnings for years. She straightened her shoulders. But I'm recovering nicely. The clarity and force of her statement silenced the room. Even Richard seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Detective Washington broke the tension, addressing Officer Davis. I think we have enough here to justify bringing Mr. Caldwell in for formal questioning. Richard, sensing the tide turning decisively against him, made one last desperate attempt. This is a family matter that's gotten out of hand. Eleanor and I had a minor disagreement about Coraline's care. There's no need for police involvement. A minor disagreement? I echoed in disbelief. You drugged my mother, stole her money, and threatened to do the same to me. You moved her to a facility against her will and forged documents to maintain control of her assets. Prove it, Richard challenged, confidence returning as he retreated to familiar ground. The legal battlefield where burden of proof might protect him. It's your word against mine. And Martin has all the properly executed legal documents showing my authority in these matters. Actually, Josephine interjected, we can prove it. She removed a small digital device from her pocket, identical to the recorder I had shown Richard at dinner the previous night. This is a recording device that Eleanor wore during your dinner last night. On it, you admit to moving Coraline against her will, to planning to have her declared incompetent, and to intending to administer medication to Eleanor without her knowledge or consent. Richard lunged for the device, but Detective Washington stepped between them. That would be tampering with evidence, Mr. Caldwell. Another charge you don't need right now. You can't use that, Richard's attorney protested. Georgia is a one-party consent state for recordings. Mrs. Caldwell didn't consent. I was the one doing the recording, I clarified. I consented to recording my own conversation. The attorney faltered, looking to Richard for direction. But Richard's attention had shifted to my mother, who had moved to stand beside me, her expression one of determined dignity. Why, Coraline? He asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. I gave you everything, security, status, a comfortable life. Why turn against me now? My mother's reply was quiet but firm. Because you never gave me the one thing that mattered, Richard. Respect. She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. My daughter showed me what respect looks like. What love looks like. And once I could see the difference, there was no going back. Richard's face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. For a man who had spent decades manipulating women through charm and calculated kindness, this rejection, this seeing through his facade, was the ultimate defeat. Officer Davis, Detective Washington said quietly, I think it's time to take Mr. Caldwell to the station. As the officer moved toward Richard, reading him his rights, Richard made one final, desperate lunge. Not toward the exit or the recording, but toward my mother. Whether he intended to harm her or simply to make a final plea, I'll never know, because in that moment, I stepped between them, physically shielding her from the man who had tormented her for 30 years. It's over, Richard, I said firmly. You've lost. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. His shoulders slumped, his expression crumpling from rage to something almost like confusion. For the first time he looked his age. An elderly man facing the end of everything he had built. As Officer Davis led Richard away, with his attorney following closely behind, Dr. Patterson attempted to slip away as well. Detective Washington stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. We'll need a statement from you as well, Doctor, he said pleasantly. About those prescriptions, among other things. The confrontation that had been building for decades was over in less than an hour. Richard Caldwell, respected community leader, church elder and serial predator, was led from the house in handcuffs, his carefully constructed facade finally shattered. In his wake, he left 3 women he had underestimated. Jennifer Emmett, who had never stopped seeking justice for her mother. My own mother, whose quiet strength had survived decades of systematic undermining. And me, the spinster daughter he had dismissed as an inconvenient obstacle. As the police cars pulled away, my mother turned to me, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. You married him, she whispered. For me. You sacrificed yourself. I pulled her into a gentle embrace. It was a strategic decision, Mom, and a temporary one. But still, she insisted, the cost to you was worth it. I finished firmly. Every uncomfortable moment, every compromise, every indignity. To see you free of him? I would do it all again in a heartbeat. My mother studied my face, her eyes clearing more with each hour as the medications left her system. You always were like your father, she said softly, seeing 10 steps ahead, planning for every contingency. I had good teachers, I replied, including her in that assessment. We stood together in the now quiet foyer, surrounded by the allies who had helped make this moment possible. Detective Washington, Josephine, Jennifer Emmett, and others arriving by the minute as news spread through our network. The dramatic confrontation had not been what I'd initially planned. I had hoped for a quiet resolution, a strategic retreat by Richard that would leave my mother safe without the trauma of a public showdown. But in hindsight, perhaps this ending was more fitting and more healing for all involved. Richard's mask had been publicly removed, his true nature exposed not just to those closest to him, but to the community he had fooled for so long. My mother had found her voice again, standing tall despite her frailty to speak her truth. And I had discovered that the skills I'd honed throughout my career, building coalitions, strategic planning, crisis management, were more than enough to defeat a predator who had underestimated me at every turn. As Josephine began discussing next steps, restraining orders, divorce proceedings, financial recovery, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle wasn't completely over, but the war had been decisively won. In protecting my mother, I had found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. In confronting Richard, I had righted not just our family's wrongs but brought justice for women whose voices had been silenced years before. And in that moment of final confrontation, standing between Richard and my mother, I had reclaimed something precious that had been stolen from both of us. Power. 6 months after Richard Caldwell was led from our home in handcuffs, I sat in the back row of a crowded courtroom, watching as he shuffled to the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, wrists and ankles shackled. At 79 he looked diminished, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a frail, elderly man facing the consequences of decades of predatory behavior. The journey to this moment had been long and, at times, exhausting. Richard had initially fought the charges vigorously, leveraging his connections and hiring the best defense attorneys his frozen assets could still reach. But as evidence mounted and additional victims came forward, his legal position had steadily deteriorated. Today was his sentencing hearing, following guilty pleas to multiple counts of elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and assault. The plea agreement had come only after prosecutors had added potential charges related to Barbara Emmett's suspicious death decades earlier. Charges that would have elevated the case to potential homicide. My mother sat beside me, her hand warm in mine. The past 6 months had transformed her. Free from Richard's manipulation and unnecessary medication, she had blossomed back into the vibrant, intelligent woman I remembered from my childhood. Her short-term memory still occasionally faltered, a natural consequence of aging, but her spirit had fully returned. You should be up there with the prosecutors, she whispered as the proceedings began. This is your victory as much as theirs. I shook my head. Seeing him face justice is enough for me. And it was. I had no desire to stand in the spotlight as Richard's nemesis. My goal had never been public vindication or recognition, but simply to protect my mother and prevent Richard from harming others. That goal had been accomplished the moment he was removed from our home. The courtroom was filled with an unlikely community that had formed around our case. Other victims and their families, advocates for elder rights, retired educators who had worked with me, members of my mother's church. Detective Washington sat a few rows ahead, his testimony having been instrumental in the case. Josephine was near the front, having served as our family's legal representative throughout the proceedings. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who had developed a reputation for harsh sentences in elder abuse cases, reviewed the plea agreement carefully before addressing Richard directly. Mr. Caldwell, over a period of more than 30 years, you systematically targeted, exploited, and abused vulnerable women who trusted you, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. You stole their financial security, isolated them from loved ones, undermined their independence, and in some cases, threatened their very lives. Richard stared straight ahead, his expression blank. Whether from genuine remorse or simply resignation, I couldn't tell. What makes your crimes particularly reprehensible, the judge continued, is the calculated nature of your behavior. These were not impulses or moments of weakness, but methodical campaigns conducted over years, with careful attention to maintaining a public image of respectability, while privately engaging in predatory behavior. She reviewed the specific charges, detailing the evidence against him for each count. When she mentioned my mother's name, I felt her hand tighten in mine. In the case of Coraline Washington, you maintained a 30-year campaign of isolation, financial exploitation, and psychological abuse, culminating in physical violence and forcible medication when she began to resist your control. The judge paused, studying Richard over her reading glasses. And when her daughter intervened to protect her, you attempted to victimize Eleanor Washington as well, going so far as to marry her under false pretenses with the intent to continue your pattern of abuse and exploitation. A murmur ran through the courtroom at this reminder of the most sensational aspect of the case, my brief, strategic marriage to Richard. Though explained repeatedly in court documents and testimony, the unusual tactics still fascinated the public and press. Before I impose sentence, the judge said, I'll hear victim impact statements. Mrs. Washington, would you like to address the court? My mother squeezed my hand before rising slowly. She made her way to the podium with dignity, her back straight despite her 74 years. For the first time since the proceedings began, Richard turned his head, watching her approach with an unreadable expression. Your Honor, my mother began, her voice steady and clear. For 30 years, I lived with a man who presented one face to the world and another to me. In public, he was charming, respected, admired. In private, he systematically dismantled my confidence, my independence, and eventually, my sense of reality itself. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The financial loss was substantial. My inheritance, my retirement savings, the home my first husband and I had worked so hard to secure for our daughter's future. But more devastating was the loss of time, of connection, of self. Richard shifted in his seat, his attorney placing a restraining hand on his arm. Richard isolated me from friends who asked too many questions, my mother continued. He discouraged visits from my daughter when she began to notice changes in me. He convinced doctors that my confusion was dementia rather than the effect of medications he was administering. And when I finally began to resist, he responded with force. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the faint remnants of bruises that had once darkened her arm. These marks have faded, but the memory of how they were inflicted remains vivid. Not just the physical pain, but the betrayal of trust from someone who had vowed to love and honor me. The courtroom was utterly silent as she continued. I am not a vengeful person, Your Honor. I don't take satisfaction in seeing anyone, even Richard, face punishment. But I believe in accountability, in consequences that match actions. Richard Caldwell systematically destroyed lives for personal gain. He betrayed the most sacred trust between spouses. And he would have continued this pattern indefinitely if not stopped. She looked directly at Richard for the first time since the proceedings began. I forgive you, she said simply. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying hatred would only allow you to continue harming me. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, and justice requires that you face them. As my mother returned to her seat, other victims and family members came forward with their statements. Jennifer Emmett spoke movingly about her mother's suspicious death and her decades-long quest for answers. A niece of Lucille Donovan described her aunt's spiral into depression after losing everything to Richard. A former caregiver testified about witnessing Richard's controlling behavior and being fired when she raised concerns. Each story reinforced the others, creating a devastating portrait of a predator who had operated unchecked for decades, protected by his status, charm, and careful selection of vulnerable victims. When all statements had been heard, the judge addressed Richard once more. Mr. Caldwell, do you wish to address the court before sentencing? Richard consulted briefly with his attorney, before rising slowly to his feet. For a moment, I thought he might maintain his silence, but then he turned slightly, scanning the courtroom until his eyes found mine. I believed I was entitled, he said, his voice raspy with age but still carrying the authoritative tone I recognized all too well. To comfort, to security, to deference from those I considered less capable. I saw myself as a manager of resources others couldn't properly appreciate or utilize. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I won't insult the court by claiming remorse I may not fully feel. What I do feel is recognition. Recognition that my carefully constructed life was built on exploitation. Recognition that I underestimated those I targeted, particularly the last one. His gaze lingered on me. Eleanor Washington saw through me when no one else did. She beat me at my own game. This wasn't the apology many had hoped for, but it was perhaps more honest, and therefore more valuable, than false contrition would have been. I accept whatever sentence the court imposes, he concluded. At my age, even a short term is effectively a life sentence. But I understand that consequences are necessary for actions like mine. The judge considered him for a long moment before delivering her decision. 20 years for the combined charges, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. At Richard's age, it was indeed a life sentence. As he was led from the courtroom, Richard paused briefly beside our row. You should have been a strategist, Eleanor, he said quietly. Not a schoolteacher. I was both, I replied simply. My mother and I watched in silence as he was escorted away. The man who had dominated our lives for so long was leaving it forever, diminished not by our vengeance but by the natural consequences of his own actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered eager for statements. We declined most interviews, but I did speak briefly to a journalist working on a series about elder abuse prevention. The most important thing to understand, I told her, is that predators like Richard Caldwell succeed because we don't talk about financial exploitation and elder abuse openly. Shame silences victims and silence protects abusers. In the months that followed, my mother and I rebuilt our life together. The legal aftermath was complex, recovering assets, untangling fraudulent transactions, restoring my mother's financial independence. But with Josephine's help, we navigated each challenge. The divorce from Richard was expedited given the circumstances, though the jokes about my brief marriage to my stepfather would likely follow me for years. I didn't mind. What had once seemed a desperate, perhaps even foolish gambit had proven to be the key that unlocked justice not just for my mother, but for all of Richard's victims. 1 year to the day after Richard's arrest, my mother and I hosted a gathering at her home. Now truly hers again in both legal fact and emotional reality. The attendees were an eclectic group: Jennifer Emmett and her family, Detective Washington and his wife, Josephine, Dr. Chen, Darlene and other church members who had formed our initial support network. Former students of mine who had contributed their professional expertise to our case. Together, we announced the formation of the Coraline Washington Foundation for Elder Justice, funded initially with a portion of the assets recovered from Richard and dedicated to education, advocacy, and direct support for victims of elder abuse. From exploitation to empowerment, my mother said, raising her glass in a toast. From isolation to community. As conversations flowed around us, my mother drew me aside to the quiet of her garden, blooming again under her careful tending after years of neglect during Richard's dominance. I've been thinking about your father lately, she said, settling onto a bench beneath the sprawling oak he had planted decades ago. About what he would make of all this. I sat beside her, noticing how the dappled sunlight through the leaves highlighted the silver in her hair. A crown of wisdom rather than a mark of defeat. He would be proud of you, I said. Of your resilience. She smiled, patting my hand. And of you, Ellie. Your father always said you had a warrior's heart and a teacher's body. He was right. We sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the beauty she was reclaiming in this new chapter of her life. At 75, my mother was dating again, cautiously, with full awareness of the red flags she had once missed or dismissed. She had resumed her volunteer work and rejoined her church choir. Most importantly, she had reclaimed her voice, becoming a powerful advocate for elder rights and financial literacy. As for me, at 69, I had discovered a new calling. The leadership skills I had honed as a principal found new expression in coordinating the Foundation's education programs. The strategic thinking that had enabled me to outmaneuver Richard now served to identify systemic weaknesses in elder protection laws and advocate for reform. I never thought I'd be grateful for those terrible years with Richard. My mother mused, watching a hummingbird hover near her carefully tended fuchsia. But without that experience, how many others would remain unprotected? How many voices unheard? It was the ultimate vindication, not just that Richard had faced justice, not just that we had recovered what was stolen, but that purpose had emerged from pain, that the very experience designed to diminish us had instead become the source of our greatest contribution. You married your stepdad to protect your mom, Darlene had said to me once, shaking her head in amazement. That's either the craziest thing I've ever heard or the bravest. Perhaps it was both. A desperate gambit born of love, a strategic calculation made under extreme pressure, a willingness to enter the lion's den armed with nothing but determination and the truth of who I was, a daughter, a teacher, a protector. In the end, that truth had proven stronger than all of Richard's carefully constructed lies. And in that victory lay the most profound vindication of all. The reminder that even in our darkest moments, when the predators of the world seem to hold all the cards, a single person standing firmly in their truth can change everything. My mother squeezed my hand gently, her eyes clear and peaceful as she gazed at the garden her own hands had brought back to life. We did it, Ellie, she said simply. We really did it. Yes, I thought, watching the light play through leaves that had weathered countless storms yet still reached for the sun. Yes, we did.